things in this speech. Firstly, what the world and what the counterfactual will look like. Secondly, the harms to the economies of these countries. And lastly, the harms to the individual people and the political systems within these countries. Firstly, what does this world tend to look like? When are these policies enforced? So what we tell you is that in a lot of developing nations, poorer nations, they currently do a bunch of non-free market policies to bolster their agricultural sector. This is what they would do if they were left to their own devices. What do these look like? Two of the most common ones. Firstly is subsidization of the sector, particularly through things like fuel subsidies, things through like fertilizer subsidies. Secondly is like price guarantees. So they stable out the price of different fluctuating agricultural goods to ensure the same price. It's a kind of subsidies, but a more particular one. Why do you think this is likely the policies that these countries have historically done and would do in the absence of the IMF and World Trade Organization? It's because they're the most easy, effective, and straightforward way to bolster an agricultural sector to ensure both production for their own country, but also like exports, which I'll talk a lot more about in this speech. So, what do the IMF and WTO come and do, given that this is what a lot of poorer nations want to do when left to their own devices? They ensure that these countries don't do these policies. First thing we tell you is that this is really, really coercive. This is for the reason that the IMF almost always come in times of crisis. So it feels like you have no choice. Either you let your country continue in its crisis, or you sort of heed to the demands, which is get rid of these agricultural policies, even if the instance, which it is, a bad thing for your interests and the interests of your country. Same to be said for the WTO. You need necessary imports and exports. You have all sorts of incentives to engage with the WTO. So even though getting rid of these agricultural policies is not in your interest, you do so anyway. It's coercive. The second thing to note is the ruling class often find it more easy to pallet these changes than the poorer people do. The ruling class don't take the fuel subsidies, so they're often more likely to cooperate with the WTO and the IMF and put these policies on this civilization. But we think when left to their own devices, the civilization of this country, the people of the country, often have enough power, even soft political power, to ensure these persisting. Okay, what is the counterfactual? Two things to note here. Firstly, we think that like all the other liberalization policies that the IMF and WTO do will likely still persist. So like all the other ones they currently do is the counterfactual, except for the agricultural ones. They might just say, well, they'll just do the other ones way more and in a way worse way. Three reasons why this doesn't matter. Firstly, some things are not a spectrum of liberalization. For example, when you float the dollar, you can't float the dollar more. Secondly, they often make it often make these countries liberalize to the maximum extent that's like feasible for that given country. So for example, they push austerity to the greatest it could possibly be before the country literally falls apart. We think that just because you don't allow them to do the agricultural thing, they can't make more austerity, the countries will fall apart. They already are maximally liberal in all of these areas. And thirdly, we think like Africa and a lot of other parts of the world have been calling for getting rid of liberalization in the agricultural sector. So we won't see that like much of a hit from the IMF and WTO to just get rid of these policies while still doing the rest. And that's the counterfactual support. Yes.
Do you think you would support government ownership of large tracts of farmland?
In some instances, in countries where it makes sense. So yes, in some instances. Firstly, onto the harms to the economy of these countries. First thing to note is these policies help to increase exports to a large extent. You become more marginally competitive against other countries in the instance which your government is subsidizing your own industry. It becomes cheaper for the individuals to produce that good. The price of the good can be lower on a global marketplace. Therefore, you get more exports in the instance that these policies persist, and the IMF and WTO don't stop you from doing these policies. Second thing to note is the European Union specifically, but a bunch of other developed nations as well, often don't have free markets within their own agricultural sectors. Like something like 30% of all the revenue in EU agricultural production is from the subsidies themselves, not from the exports. What that means for these countries is that you need the subsidies to be competitive. It's not like, the IMF or WTO just lower everyone evenly so the marketplace becomes fair. It's actually the inverse of that, which is to say countries that are rich get a free pass for a bunch of different structural reasons, and poor countries don't. So in order for them to be competitive, they need these subsidies and these other sort of policies which make them more competitive on the global marketplace. Thirdly, we think for a lot of these countries, their only route for real export growth is through these industries. Why is this the case? Because the other options, things like factories, often take huge amounts of investment. You need rich countries or rich actors investing in factories. They take some really long amount of time to get going. And lastly, they might just be rich in agriculturally fertile land. We think this is why they access exports the most in this way, and a lot of other options are less feasible. Therefore, you get less exports of agricultural production in these countries, and you should think that exports make up for a large amount of their export base. Three impacts of this. Firstly, to the farmers themselves. I think in economics debates, people often forget about the actual people making the money. Why this is so bad from them. Often these countries were exporting a fair amount of agricultural production before the IMF or WTO came in. What does that mean? A bunch of people depend on exporting their farmland. There's more agricultural production in the country than the country themselves will eat. So in the instance that the country can no longer competitively export, these people lose their jobs. It's terrible for their life. Their farms shut down, their families fall apart. And this is what causes overcrowded and volatile cities. When you have all sorts of people moving from agricultural centres to the cities when there's not enough jobs there for them to work, this is a huge harm to those people who are once living stable and relatively prosperous lives for their conditions to moving absolutely terrible lives. Secondly, exports are important because they stimulate economic growth in general. This is the multiplier effect, right? These people become poorer, they move to the cities, it overcrowds, but there's not enough money. Generally, the economy slows down, worse quality of life. You can't import like simple things into a country like slightly more advanced medicine or like enough, nice furniture and nice books to teach your next generation of students. You need money in an economy to make people's lives happy and prosperous. Third reason low exports are bad. You have less currency reserves. So in these countries, you need the exports in order to get other people's currency and hold them in reserves. You can't do that as easily in the instance you don't have goods to offer the global marketplace. Why is this bad? Especially in these countries with very unstable and volatile dollars. Having large currency reserves is often important to sort of like brace yourselves for economic shocks, which can be very important for a country's economic prosperity. Second point, which is harms to the person and the political societies in these countries. Note, I think a lot of people are agriculturally producing in these countries, so you should think that this mechanism affects a huge amount of people within their economy. Firstly, I've already told you how the subsidies help these people keep their farms going and export and have lives where they make an income and all of these kinds of good things. But subsidies also help people in like sort of collateral ways, in ways which aren't intended by the subsidy. So for example, fuel subsidies are really important to like drive your sick child to hospital or like drive to connect different family members who might be living in different places. Fuel is very expensive. In the instance around fuel subsidies, you just decrease the quality of life in a bunch of ways, including transporting people around. This is also important for things like fertilizer, right? It might just not only affect these big exporting agricultural hubs, but also smaller farms where now people can't eat as much and can't depend on their own growth as much and instead have to resort to buying things they might not have the money to do so. Therefore, quality of life is worse. Just briefly, these countries often have very volatile political states. They often have like other groups or cartels who are willing to come in and support in the instance that there's government failure. We think when these farmers are likely to see the government as failing them, they're more likely to turn to these routes. Thank you.
Two simple claims from opening opposition. The first claim is to explain that this trade liberalization was necessary for these countries to access Western markets, and that without this trade liberalization, they would have never been able to access these markets. The second argument is just to explain why this liberalization itself led to an increase in agricultural productivity. First argument, what was the problem historically with a lot of developing countries in agriculture? The problem wasn't that they were giving too many fuel subsidies. The problem was these agricultural sectors were massive state-owned conglomerates, either in China, in India, and Mexico, where oligarchs, or the state itself, own massive parts of the agriculture industry. Why is this an extremely likely and true characterization? The first thing to point out is these states were often quite authoritarian, so it's very easy to do things like eminent domain. It's very easy to do things like rigged auctions in order to get as much state as possible. The second thing to point out is a lot of these states were straight up communist regimes, so obviously they believed in the extent of which of the collectivization of agriculture, like in China, that sort of thing. And the third is that farmers in these countries were probably the groups of people with the least amount of political power in order to resist this collectivization of agriculture. Why is this so incredibly bad in the first place? It is just to point out that these countries are able to sell grain at significantly below market rates and significantly below the rates in which farmers would like, because farmers had no say over grain production, because if they refused to farm, they would have been shot or sent to gulags, like what happened in the Soviet Union, like what happened in China, or they were just simply starved to death in India. So that's an explanation why these state-owned conglomerates produce grain at significantly below market levels on the world market. Why was this liberalization necessary? Because it broke up the state-owned agricultural monopolies, so Western states didn't have to tariff the shit, was straight up ban exports from these countries. Why is this true? The first thing to point out is that the agricultural lobby is extremely powerful in Western countries in status quo. Firstly, they own large portions of land, so they probably have some sway over the government if they want to do eminent domain and take land in developed countries. The second reason is they just output a large amount of goods. The United States is still, well, up until like the 2000s, was still the #1 food exporter in the world. The third reason is often the way in which the political structures of these countries works favored farmers, like the United States Senate system, where fucking Idaho, which has like 20 people that are all just farmers, have 2 Senate seats, as compared to California that has like 30 more billion people, which is just an explanation why in a lot of Western countries, particularly the United States, farmers had enormous amounts of political power. This meant that because these state-owned conglomerates were so controlled and so willing to dump agricultural goods on the open market, these farmers were very easily able to lobby the government in order to prevent the export of these goods to Western countries. Why was then the liberalization important? The liberalization was important for 3 reasons. Firstly, at the point at which you break up these state-owned monopolies and put it in private farmers, they're now selling at maybe still below market rates, but rates that are far more acceptable to farmers. Like, you're probably willing to accept some degree of imports to a country if they're like 10% cheaper, because you still have an advantage of distribution, you still have some sort of advantage over like people like their American-made corn. But at the point at which it was like literally 100th of the world's price, and that oligarchs were willing to let their people suffer in order to sell this grain, was the point at which these monopolies were likely to do mass selling dumping. Secondly, when this trade liberalization occurred, it meant that countries like India and China can now far easily sell agricultural goods to the West. Why is this extremely important? One, he already does the work for us by explaining all the impacts of agricultural goods and exports. Secondly, it's a necessary precondition of development, because by building agriculture, it means you are now incentivized to build roads and ports in order to export that agriculture. You now need the institutional state structures in order to collect taxation and regulate that agriculture. You need to do all these phases of development that leads to future development. At the point at which you never got access to the Western markets in the first place, who are dominated and largely controlled and lobbied by the agriculture sector, it just means you weren't able to sell those goods. Why is this an absolute crushing win for opening opposition? One, because they strangled a baby in the cradle, right? They never get the exports they want in the first place, so they're never able to get any of those benefits because these large state conglomerates needed to be broken up. Secondly, it explains why the pressure from these states was especially important, because without pressure from the United States, who had political leverage in other means, without pressure from the European Union, who had other forms of political pressure, it means they have no incentive to ever liberalize their trade sector. Because if all your oligarch buddies just own every single hacienda in Mexico, then who the fuck cares about rising prices and less exports? Because you're still the richest person out there. There's no reason why you would self-liberalize. So that is why it was clearly important for liberalization. I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, so if you're in an authoritarian regime, don't you have a closed economy and therefore you don't listen to IMF or the World
China is an authoritarian regime that is part of the WTO and IMF and takes trade. Well, Madagascar takes loans from the IMF. Egypt takes loans from the IMF. Turkey takes loans from the IMF. Authoritarian regimes absolutely engage with the foreign markets because of the reasons explained by Pian. You want foreign currency in order to buy other goods so you could drive around Ferraris with your rich buddies in your close-up servers. It means that you're able to resist foreign actors more the more you're engaged with foreign economy. There's a reason why Iraq got invaded, because they did literally no international trade. It insulates you from further risk. Obviously, authoritarian regimes have strong incentives to interact with the outside world. The second argument will explain why the agricultural liberalization was extremely important for workers' rights in these countries. The first thing to point out is the way in which this liberalization mostly occurred is the dividing up and breaking of either large state-owned assets, like the haciendas in Mexico, or it was allowing farmers to sell their own grain, what happened under Deng Xiaoping in China. Why was this extremely important? One, because previously, farmers had no incentive to continue to produce grain if you're not seeing any profit from each additional unit of grain produced, which explains why these countries produce particularly low levels of grain. But the second reason is to explain that at the point at which you now make a profit from, the second point is now you make an additional profit from selling grain, you're likely to have significantly increased wages, which means you spend more on goods. It means you're more likely to send your kids to education. It means you're more likely to pay taxes and redevelop in the country that's important. And no, as we mentioned earlier, farmers have no fucking political power. There was no reason why under the counterfactual any sort of liberalization within the agriculture sector was likely to occur, because they just don't have power. They're poor farmers that were unlikely to have a large education. They were unlikely to be part of party bureaucracies. They were likely to continue in poverty and suffering for the rest of their lives. Why is this an absolute debate-crushing win? One, we just get the most amount of people a fairly substantial increase in their living wage, which just means their lives are better. They're able to do more things. It means that these countries are able able to export more goods, which leads to further development because the world market is willing to pay a higher price than what was in the domestic market, meaning that they don't have to sell amongst themselves on the black market in the counterfactual. If they did illegally on-sell goods, they'll now be able to access those global markets. Well, even if you don't believe that claim, it's just an explanation why it was easier for them to access their own wages and to increase their wage growth. So proud to oppose.
Three things in the speech. Firstly, I'd like to quickly re-explain the argument brought up by Alessandro. Secondly, I'd like to whip out substantive and explain why open opposition falls out of this debate. The first thing I just want to briefly explain the substantive flag by Alessandro, where they explain that when you don't trust the government because they've taken away the way that you mean to live your life, when you lose the fuel subsidies, that means you can travel around town and go to different places, you just have a massive distrust in the government. Obviously, we just explained this is obviously likely to occur because these are the main ways you engage with society, and we just believe that often distrust often builds in areas when you feel like the oligarchs are going against you. We also explained instead that these are often groups and so this is often controlled by the ruling class who aren't affected by this policy to a greater degree. This is just to suggest that you build up a massive resentment towards the government. Why is it particularly bad? We explained that when you have a massive resentment to the government, particularly in areas of like where you have a massive agricultural industry, you're more likely to learn to cartels. These are people who always have access to things such as agriculture, people who provide you employment and jobs, etc. We explained this is massively harmful for a few reasons. Firstly, it just means that you're more likely to engage in crime and other reckless ideals. It means you're less likely to be able to have other alternative benefits to your way of life. It means you're less trapped and are unable to engage in economies in more productive ways. That in itself is exclusive from the substantive right privacy and is a way that takes us forward in the debate. First thing I can do is just quickly whip the substantive that Alessandro provided, impact them and explain why really important. The first thing he explains, there are just massive economic harms that occurs when you're unable to do things that, when you're unable to increase the amount of exports. We just explained that the subsidies that occur in our world are extremely important and impactful to the way that they work. We explain this increases the marginal competition when they in a global scale. We explained that EU doesn't operate in a free market. This is particularly harmful. And we explained this is the only route for these people. He's doing things that just other factors are expensive and timely. Why is this extremely powerful? I just win this debate from the outset. Three things. Firstly, you should just extremely care because of how the coercive nature of this. By the fact that it's extremely coercive industry and how it's constructed, it is important that they escape from these economic harms, even if you do not believe they're as bad as we tell you at opening. But secondly, we explain that these are such a vulnerable set of people. These are farmers who relies on these exports for their day-to-day lives, who rely on the ability to have that marginal competition in international economics to be able to live their day-to-day lives. But thirdly, because of the massive scale of the time, we explain quite coherently that we stimulate economic growth through our own things throughout these countries themselves by, for example, we're allowed to brace ourselves through things such as currency reserves. This just explains that this argument is already more important than all the things Ziggy explained to you, even if you believe his arguments to the fullest degree. Obviously, this is much more harmful. The second thing, I also believe is an extremely impactful argument, which we explain that we just help the people and the politics when these countries excel. We explain that these fuel subsidies and fertilizer subsidies are just really helpful for other facets of life. It allows you to drive to the hospital when your parents are sick because you don't know, because they were sick in the morning because they've been screwed over by Ziggy's policy. Secondly, you get things such like price guarantees, which means you're able to get long-term stability and planning. No, this is exclusive from the economic harms that Ziggy tries to prove. Even if you don't believe this, it's just better for the way of life of these people because they believe that in the long term they're going to be okay and they're protected by the farms and the government who they think like them. Now, why is this extremely impactful? First, you just want to note this is uncontingent from all the economic harms that we explained in this first opening clash. Even if you believe that maybe you get slightly worse economic harms than believe Ziggy's speech, we just explained that this is extremely harmful for the people themselves, and we much prefer that they have these subsidies to protect their way of life. We just explain on scale this is an extremely massive amount of people, but also these extremely harmful. Don't underweigh the impact that people going to see their friends and family and take them to the hospital and take them to schools is extremely important. You'll be probably looking at your notes at the end of the debate thinking, shit, this is messy and economics is stupid. This is the impact should be certain and land at the end of the debate. Okay, now I'd like to respond to Ziggy's substantive. The The first thing he tries to explain to us is that, like, well, this wasn't necessary to get access into markets because of Western markets because of state-owned oligarchs. But I think Ziggy extremely relies on the examples he explains to us, such as like China and India, because we just explained that in other places, such as in other countries in the sub-Sahara, they just needed to get the validation of their people. They weren't able to have like state oligarchical societies in which they could just mandate and force and coerce the way Ziggy suggests. We suggest this is true for a few reasons. Firstly, because you just like need your people to be able to support you. You need the farmers to work on the farms and build the agriculture so they can do things and they make the money for it. But secondly, historically, like oligarchies are really bad at producing agriculture, particularly effectively at a low price. Because of their restrictions they put on the people, the strain and lack of trust in government that occurs. So we should explain that in other contexts, this does not occur nearly to the degree Ziggy suggests, and it means that they are able to do things that access to other markets. But the second thing he explains is that, like, well, in our world, you get massive, in his world, you get massive lobbying against like Western anomalies. But we just explained this is really uncomparative because the counterfactual is they're still able to export to Western countries. Because we explained this relationship does occur, but it just occurs. This just occurs to the WTO instead. And what they do instead is negotiations. They just ask like, for one less thing. They just ask you don't do all the liberalization of the markets that occurs on our side. This just explains that obviously you still are able to export to Western countries in our side, and that relationship still occurs. Now, note that just levels Ziggy's argument because it relies on the contention that you need that these lobbying groups with the ability that prevented access to the Western markets to occur in the first one. Because this doesn't exist, they're unable to get access. Before I go into my second rebuttal, I'll take a point of closing. Yeah.
Why would the IMF have given developing countries loans if they couldn't force them to liberalize their markets?
Because they still can get better. Oh, sorry. No. We explained that they do liberalize their market, but they still. Actually, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. You can take that. I'll concede that. Okay. Second thing Ziggy tries to explain then is that you're able to like produce low levels of grain, you can do things in the country itself, and this means that you're able to get like better prices and wages for the people within this country, and this is really important. Two responses. The first thing is on mitigation is, as explained earlier at the start of speech, this is often controlled by the people in the ruling class. This is probably diluted to the to the lesser vulnerable people within the society themselves. So it's not that very high impact. But secondly, I think our second substantive neatly deals with this, because I think we'd much prefer that these people have access to guaranteed subsidies that can protect their way of life, rather than the potential of getting slightly higher wages. We explained that obviously on our side, through our first example, we think we just get high wages and get high economic growth. But if you don't believe that, we should explain that things such as like subsidies, so fuel subsidies, they can able and go and take their family to the hospital or go to schools is much more impactful and better able for these people to engage with than slightly high wages. Wages change up down over time. We also tend to run a much more certain way to benefit these groups of people. Okay, what do you believe at the end of the speech? Firstly, we just prove a massive substantial economic harm to these groups of people. Secondly, we provide a personal harm to the people who work within these farms, factories themselves. And thirdly, like, if you really want another sweetener for opening government, like, joining cartels is really bad, dude.
Good to go? Sweet. Ziggy concedes the biggest harm of what mentioned this debate in that speech, because he recognised that international companies are incredibly predatory in the way that they invest in countries that are, the vast majority of the time, nascent democracies in this debate, where they're in a political tinderbox of things very likely to go wrong, and very politically unstable countries, where very little can incite violence from opposing groups, where you have groups that very nearly won or lost civil wars, that are still very much in power and still very influential in countries. It is pivotally important that you have a country that is stable in terms of food supply, in terms of international relations, but most importantly, in terms of neo-colonial threats that are around you. If it appears as though you're accepting a neo-colonial bribe, it's very unlikely in a country that just decolonized that the people are just going to be like, yeah, that was a chill thing that happened. It seems far more likely that they will stand up, get armed, and do something about it and take over the government. That is something that is a problem. Because under both sides of this debate, there was probably likely to be some oligarch who was in charge or owned a lot of agricultural companies. The question is just, which type of oligarch did you want? Did you want someone who is domestically in power, who is part of the nation in our worst case? Or did you want what their likely case was, which was that there was someone from overseas, a major TNC, who buys up a bunch of land because it is cheaper than the land that they have in their own country, and did a bunch of really predatory things there? We suggest suggest that that was far worse for 3 reasons. The first of which is this is something that was a neo-colonial imposition on these developing countries, and that was problematic. This will prove that is an inherently unjust action, which suggests that even if you believe this is a more efficient use of the economic power, the people of that country would not prefer that. And it secondly will prove that even if you value economics, this will likely lead to a civil war, which is something that's obviously far worse than any sort of economic benefit the government bench could prove. The framing of this is just that most nascent democracies decolonized through a civil war, through people standing up and getting armed there, which did just mean that there were people who were still soldiers who were willing and able to take up fighting if they could, if they were so inclined. Why is this action a neo-colonial one? It is for 2 reasons. It is first of what opening government points out, that this is a coercive action taken by these relative industries. But secondly, and more importantly, this is often done by colonial states themselves. Countries like the IMF are majorly powered by Britain, by Germany, by France. The very same countries that were colonial powers that imposed on these countries for hundreds of years. Secondly, why is this likely to lead to domestic instability? For 2 reasons. Firstly, it is likely to be framed by these groups as literally stealing your food. Because if GovBench is right and a lot of these countries and companies want to export their goods, that means that the people of these countries are not getting access to the food that they desperately need. But secondly, food is something people care a lot about. Because firstly, they are starving. People are so poor. They have no money because they've often just been in civil wars, which means that their country is demolished. They have no stable industry. They have no access to goods and services around them. They have a limited ability to access employment that isn't in the agricultural sector, which does just mean that they need this stuff. But secondly, many of these people are employed in agriculture, which does just prove to you because that many nascent democracies and countries that are developing, because they don't have access to big tech industries or things like that, it means that the most proximate industry that they can get employed in is agriculture. Their family farm that they've owned for thousands of years are the types of things that they're likely to be employed in. What is the impact of this? Twofold and debate winning. The first of which is this goes against what these people fought and died for in terms of these civil conflicts that did exist during the process of decolonization. But secondly, when you are in a political tinderbox of conflict, which is just after these countries are decolonizing, when countries in the West are trying to take advantage of the new labor force that is coming into the world, when these countries are accepting these sorts of bribes that are existing from places like the IMF, it is incredibly likely and important that you keep this country stable, that you ensure that people are employed domestically, not internationally, that you do not look like you're being neo-colonial at all, because the point that you do that, the same people that fought and died for decolonization are the same people who will take up arms against a government who simply cannot afford another conflict. Second extension, why this makes you more vulnerable to price shocks internationally. This is the case for 3 reasons. Firstly, if you are importing a whole lot of goods internationally because you have not subsidized your domestic industry, and notably, opening government points to the fact that countries like the EU subsidize agriculture enormously, which means it was very unlikely that you were able to compete against that sophisticated industry. So these countries you are likely to be tied to the prices of this food, which does just mean that when places like Ukraine go through a famine or go through a drought or something like that, they're obviously going to prioritize selling their goods domestically because it's cheaper to do so. It is expensive to export stuff over continent lines, which means you have no source of food, which means that your people are hungry and go starving during times of international crisis. But secondly, because you have no food reserves, you will just have more famines. When things go wrong, when shipments don't arrive on time, people starve. That is a risk you simply cannot afford. But thirdly, you do not develop your domestic industry. The ways that these countries develop economically is if you have a system of perfect competition, where you have a whole bunch of small farms competing against one another of who can be more efficient. And these people will be employed. These people will be able to sell goods. So even if you believe that it's more efficient to buy goods internationally, the problem is these people don't have any money because they're not working, because they can't compete with the international sources of goods. So it does just mean it's unlikely that they were able to afford the goods even if they were cheaper. The impact of this is twofold. It means that you will fall to predatory loans with things like the One Belt and One Road initiative that did just take up ports that were incredibly strategically important for countries that were developing and were held under a stronghold of developed economies for 100 years. But secondly, labor mobility is crucial in these countries because industry does just fluctuate. So it means you need to have as maximum amount of employment opportunities as possible to ensure that country is stable. I would love to take a point if anyone has one.
Well, yeah, you said this would cause civil wars, but it didn't. We're defending status quo.
So it's far more likely to cause civil wars than not, but also there are civil wars that are going on in African countries like regularly. Like Sudan has been in a civil war for the past 20 years between groups that are, because these people aren't able to gain access to employment because they can't compete with international cost. That's just unfortunately untrue. Final extension. Why this locks out smaller farmers from being able to participate, and why it means they're likely to be bought out and be a part of international conglomerates. The framing of this is just 30% of all workers in these countries are in the agriculture industry, so this affects an enormous amount of people, so you therefore should weigh it very highly. We think opening government gets it a bit wrong here. It's not about exporting goods to other countries, because obviously that was something that was expensive to do so, and you were unlikely to be able to compete with international prices of goods. What was far more likely is you were just selling to people domestically, selling to people closer to you, particularly because you weren't producing on the scale of these larger companies that existed internationally. What happens that we specifically regret? Firstly, it is cheaper to import goods from neighboring countries when you do not subsidize your own industries, which means that you didn't buy foods from people who are surrounding you. But secondly, big international conglomerates set up shop in these countries, and that was something that was incredibly harmful and activates the harms that Ziggy talks about. He says that, well, there are a bunch of companies that open their doors on to these other countries so that they could enact and could get these IMF loans. But the problem with this is that most of the time these IMF loans were not to open up the agricultural economy. They were to save these economies from dying. It was loans to places like Argentina and Venezuela when they were in economic crisis. This, the vast majority of the time, was not for agricultural purposes, which means that claim, whilst maybe reliant on facts, is the wrong facts.
Governments in the developing world really suck at centrally managing economies, so the first extension is going to explain that the governments that were doing the management were incompetent and therefore the market is better. But second of all, even if that isn't the case, we just explained the most important thing in this debate is the IMF giving you a loan when your economy is collapsing. We're just going to explain that those loans were entirely conditioned on your agricultural markets liberalizing. That'll win closing opposition to the debate. First of all, on market competition being better at reducing prices than governments. The first thing we're going to explain is that governments were actually really bad at doing what opening government explained they were doing things like subsidies, doing things like price control. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, these governments had a huge level of corporate capture. That is, people that were important and powerful within the government were also important and powerful within the agricultural industry. The reason you know this is that you needed to be rich to be a politician in these countries. The way you became rich is by making a lot of money off agriculture, which just means even if you have the capacity to do agriculture regulation, do effective subsidies, do effective price setting, you don't, because it would lose your family money. But second of all, even if everyone in these political institutions were benevolent angels, they lack the information that you need to be able to do things like direct subsidies and set prices. Because first of all, you don't have the resources to collect information on the efficiency of every producer, you don't have stable access to data, to the internet, and that's really bad, because setting prices and delivering subsidies is really difficult and requires extremely intimate knowledge on the efficiency of different producers. The upshot of this, the other reason the government's bad at doing this is because even if they're really good and benevolent, they've got split priorities. And then finally, they don't impose this kind of regulation effectively because, again, they don't have the resources. The impact of this is twofold. First of all, if it is true that side-opening government and closing government, therefore, are supporting subsidies to various farmers, the subsidies aren't going to the struggling farms that are critical parts of the country's infrastructure. They're going to the friends of the people who are in power and that are deciding the subsidies, meaning they're entirely wasteful in the economic sense. But second of all, it means you set prices wrong. And this is really disastrous and important to understand. Because if you set the price too low, that is, the price of grain should be $5 and you set it at $2, it means people buy too much grain and you run out of grain. It means people go hungry when they should have been buying another crop. And if you set the price too high, then that's obviously bad, because it means people are paying too much for food and they can't afford things that they need, which means you set prices wrong and you entirely annihilate your economy, which means the response from opening government about the stability of prices is just wrong, because if they are stable badly because you set them at the wrong rate. But second of all, because the government is likely to run out of money and the capacity to enforce these prices, these price pegs do just collapse, which leads to far more chaos and far more instability. The second claim from opening government is saying that this means that fuel is a benefit. I think this is beaten by opening opposition. Second part of this claim, even if the government is good at doing all the things that I've just described they suck at, we would just rather they didn't. Because first of all, we'd rather they invest this time, money, and energy into things that are directly beneficial for economy. Doing things like building schools, doing things like building roads, doing things like delivering welfare, things that directly and certainly help people, as opposed to funneling money through the hands of a few farmers. But second of all, this is bad because it props up failing industries. If a farmer would have failed without government subsidies, that farmer should be entering manufacturing or administration or moving to the city. That land should have been repurposed. And at a market and industrial level, if it is true that the industry would have collapsed without these subsidies, those industries should collapse. The economy should reskill and produce something it is good at and buy agriculture from a neighbor, which just means in the worst case of government bench, it is fine because resources are allocated more efficiently. But finally, on the flip, even if you don't believe any of that, I'm just going to explain that market competition is really good. It is good because, first of all, if prices are too high by one producer, having competitive markets allows you to buy at a cheaper price from a different and more efficient producer, which just means that prices will naturally decrease. But second of all, on the flip side, wages are too low, people just go and work for the better, high-paying, and better regulated firm, which just means that markets are good at allocating these kinds of resources and prices go down. Let's closing government prove this extension. They say that big companies come in, buy up all the land, monopolize, and this means there isn't competition. First of all, there are many transnational agricultural firms that all have the same idea, which means even if you believe it is only transnational corporations doing farming in these countries, they are still competing with one another. They are still trying to get the lowest price, they are still trying to recruit the most workers, and obviously the way you do that is by having good practices. But second of all, their extension knifes this claim, because they say everyone really fucking hates those colonists. Why would you be selling your agricultural land to those colonists? If the hate was so high, you would kill your government leaders if that is the thing that happened. Which means that if it is so bad as closing government, suggest, that kind of transaction doesn't occur. Let's weigh this against the claim of price shocks from closing government, because they say that this leads to more instability if the EU can't farm anymore. Simple intuition here, domestic instability is far more likely than every international farm being unstable for all of the reasons that I just described. The result of all of that is, the government is bad at setting prices, the market is good, which means that we fill the gap in opening opposition, because we explain where you can actually compete on the international market, where opening opposition just described that you get access to those markets. This is the most important thing in the debate. I'll take one from opening if you've got one.
Yeah, you're about to claim, and opening already claimed, that under our world, rich countries won't trade or give loans to countries who have illiberal agricultural sectors. The topic says we regret the pressure placed on developing countries. We defend a world where there was no pressure, not a world where there was pressure, but developing countries just didn't heed.
I'm going to describe that in the absence of that pressure, that loan would never have been offered. So like, those two things have to occur at the same time. Apologies if I misunderstand. Second extension, why this means you can't access international emergency support. First thing to explain, the IMF would not have bailed out a country that had an illiberal agricultural sector. The reason for this is simple. If you are advertising to the world that the government is taking money and giving it to inefficient farmers, no one's going to give you money, because the IMF knows all of that cash just goes to inefficient farmers. Which just means in order to justify to themselves and to the international community that they are giving you money and supporting you, you must have a more liberal agricultural sector. Because like, the things that open government describe are expensive, and if the IMF expects that you're spending money on those instead of helping people and giving people jobs and reskilling your economy, they just won't give you any money. And this is the most important thing, because these loans are offered, as described by open government, when you're in the most debt, when your economy is doing the worst and we need the most assistance. Which means in the absence of these loans, everyone loses their jobs. No one gets social security, no schools are open, no roads are built. This impacts the entire economy, but everyone else in this debate only describes the agricultural sector. So obviously, we save countries from failing, because they otherwise would have been denied these loans. But second of all, and in even larger scale, you don't get any foreign investment from private actors if you don't have liberal markets, for the exact same set of reasonings. If you know that your prices can't be predicted, or if money could be taken away by the government, you don't put any money into upskilling laborers within a developed world, within the developing world. You don't put any money into paying people better or building roads, which just means the developing world is just not allowed access to developed world capital, which means they can't invest in themselves more. Obviously a really bad thing. The governments are bad, the market provides, and we allow them to get access to IMF loans. All good, panel?
First on CO, then defending our extension, and then OO, then weighing over OG. First on CO, they make two claims. First claim they make is that governments are incompetent, and this stems into like two sub-claims they try and make. First thing they try and tell you is that subsidies are then likely to be bad. Why is this the case? They say there's a crossover like of corporate like people and like that they're in bed with like the government, or a lot of it's the same people and they're like they're gonna do it poorly. I have a couple problems with this. One, I would tell you that subsidies are not just done and dished out by the government on whim. Often they're done on applications that need to be evaluated. So people submit to you, which is to say, it is not like completely within your power, like you decide and distribute. The second thing I would tell you is that often like into these governments, like I would say that a large percentage of them, like at the point where 30% of your employment is coming from agriculture within your company, this is also going to be reflected within your government. There are interests in there to like do them correctly. The second part of this claim that they make is that there's just a broad lack of information within these developing countries. They're unlikely to do it well. One, I just posit like this is blanket untrue. Like I would posit that like in most countries there are some people that understand how the economy works, or some people that understand this is how you maximize your land. But the second thing I tell you is that like the alternative in their world is like to create institutions and like bring in like foreign intelligence, like try and figure out how to like best figure like maximize your profits or best like set the economy well in a level that's healthy. I would tell you that these are the actors that have the possible like they're likely to have the worst intention in the round, because these are FDI actors that have the intention to bleed you dry. Insofar as you believe they're completing or like insofar that you believe the likely case there is competing oligarchs that have to compete with each other, because that's the competition mechanism they try and push. They all have the incentive to bleed you the most dry, so that A, no one else can use you, but B, they get the most out of you, right? So insofar as like you think that the insofar as the round goes down to like who is best able to regulate the country, even in the existence of bad actors in the government, I would say that domestic actors that are bad have much better intentions than foreign actors that are bad. Okay. Second thing they say here is like, the second thing they claim here is that like, and this is to like skirt around the idea that like they fuck over smaller firms. They're like, well, even if you are a smaller farmer, if you are disutile to the country, you should just reskill. I would tell you that like this is like, I would just say this is blasphemous, because I would tell you in the developing world, there's just like an insane number of reasons why you as a farmer would not be like able to compete like actively, even though like at your best capacity you could, but there's a number of factors that would say like there's a number of factors that aren't in your control that in the presence of a subsidy would turn your farm or turn your firm into like something that is massively profitable. The final thing they say specifically on this point is that like they tell you that like FDI is like FDI doesn't happen because of like the max that we give you, because like this is to our point about like political sentiment, not wanting to buy into colonial states. I'll tell you firstly, like it is just a coercive investment. They're offering you so much money, you just actually don't have a choice, even if you politically disagree with them. It is unjust, it is coercive, and this you have no other options. The second thing they say is like, competition. Like competition still exists because they're competing oligarchs that are overseas. I tell you that these are the worst kind of actors because they are so massive, so they are willing to do whatever they want to just like rinse the fuck out of you. The second claim they make is the IMF is no longer willing to give you a loan because all of their things are like all of their criteria on how to like repay back that loan, and all of their criteria on like why you should be given it are things that are agriculturally lost. I would tell you this is untrue for two reasons. One, like the actors in the IMF and like that are part of like the WTO just have an interest in like you being a stable country that like doesn't like cease to exist, right? Which is to say, like they want to do things like export out of you eventually, but they also look to you for things like labor. They look to you for things like for things like being able to grab your to grab your labor force. It's within their interest to make sure that you are continually to be stable. What does CG bring you in this debate? We bring you three claims. One, we bring you a large like I guess like principled-ish push on like why the neo-colonial imposition is like ideologically unjust, but also it's just like increases the likelihood of like it increases the likelihood of like civil conflict, which is to say that a lot of these countries are still in like their post-development state, and are still like on the tipping point of like they're very close, like they are just coming off of a lot of wars. They are just coming off of a lot of like ideological conflicts. Which is to say, when you do something like buy into like these large things or buy into these international pressures that are colonial, which are things you just ran for, these can be the tipping points for conflicts and that things that happen. Second, let me tell you is that like you are more sure against things like international price shocks, which is to say, when you build your economy around having to import and export more, you become much more dependent on, I guess, affected by things like increased like international cost tariffs, things like late shipments, etc. Right? Like at the point where we, on our side of the house, are more likely to develop like more internally robust economies, it's just better for these countries. The final thing we tell you here is that like you just lock smaller firms out. Okay, next moving on to OO. They make two claims. First thing the claim they make is like liberalization was the key to access Western markets. Okay, I'm gonna make 2 points here. One, I would say like this is not the only way that they could access Western markets. Like there are other exports you can have. A lot of these countries are like quite rich in like natural resources that Western markets want. But I would just tell you that it's actually unclear that full access to Western markets is solely a good thing. Which is to say that like in the absence of like internal oligarchs, you have like international oligarchs, and I would say like these are probably quite worse because they care much less about you, and it's quite likely. The second thing is just this is the other thing about like to whip this again. This is the thing about reshaping your economy around like reshaping your economy around having to import and export more. It's just much worse for shock. But the final thing is like there's just like a massive brain drain of dependency. But that's only to suggest that like I'm unclear that it's solely a good thing. You should weigh this against the harms that it could bring. But the other thing I suggest is like, I don't think open opposition does the comparative, which is to say, bad actors exist on either side of the house when bad governments cannot regulate those bad actors. Where do you want those bad actors to come from? We tell you domestic actors are much more likely to A, be controllable, but B, have domestic interests at heart because they are the ones that have to reuse this land and have to keep going on. Okay, second point that they make is that you have like an increase in like agricultural productivity for workers' rights. And I would just posit that like, even if like actually buy into this to the maximum extent, I would say this is only true for like the top end of farmers that exist and like own massive like amounts of land in these countries, which is like, say like the feudal overlords that like rain down, you just massively entrench the inequality there because these farmers like just are fine, right? Like maybe they get some extra benefit, maybe they get some extra money, but all of the small farmers, they were unable to scale their farms upward and unable to cater to like the FDI, to the foreign markets that wanted massive amounts of food. Like they get fucked, right? Like because there's no one like wanting to buy their stuff. Before OG, I'll take a point from the closing.
If you don't get an IMF loan and your economy collapses, it means big companies buy up all of your assets and do kind of anti-competitive behavior you describe in agriculture, but in the chemical industry.
So the comparative is like they just already have that, right? Like the comparative is they already have their foot in the door and they already like have a chokehold on your agricultural industry and your country's already fucked. But I will also just call back to like my responses as to why the IMF is willing to give you a loan otherwise, right? Like they have the incentive to like keep your country afloat. They have the incentive to keep your labor force afloat so they can take it eventually and so like they have good relations with you. Okay, finally weighing over OG. Why do we weigh over OG? I think specifically with OG talks to like a lot more individualistic benefits on the economy wise. They talk to benefits to farmers, they talk to benefits like relating to government trust, and they talk to benefits to like the manufacturers and like the means of production. The reason why do we outweigh this? I think it's quite simple because our extension A like wins on principle. On net, we ideologically have the interest of these developing countries at heart, and we prevent them from like having to buy into these coercive measures. 2, we specifically talk to like the reformation of like the economy at large, which is to say we talk to the healthiness of these economies and markets as they develop, as they are quite formative and as they are like quite like malleable, I guess, right? And so in the context of where these economies end up in long term, CG is able to capture why this is best. But the final thing is we actually just like cite why like tipping any sort of like scale in like the political ideology balance is particularly bad within countries with large ideological differences that are coming off the back of like conflicts because they are actually willing to do things like reform civil unrest.
First on our 2 extensions, then closing, then opening, then finally weighing over our op bench. First on our 2 extensions. Our first extension explains why market competition is just better at reducing prices. We explain that that the government is uniquely bad at this, and that markets are just better at reducing prices effectively. Thus, we get better outcomes for farmers. We're better at meeting the domestic demand that ensures that people have access to food because there's more effective price mechanisms at reaching that demand, and we make life better for both the farmers and the people in these nations. The response we get from closing government is just say that the government has access to experts, like maybe they can do this. But like the level of like technical expertise is like maybe somewhat symmetric. We'd argue farmers are probably independently better at this. Maybe let's assume the government has access to this too. Obviously the information that we're specifically talking about is information that comes from the price mechanism, right? It's the ability to tell how much demand you can meet by knowing how many resources you'll use, etc. It's the unique information that comes from the price mechanism. You cannot have that when you are having things subsidized in ways to distort the market's ability to detect this information. Clearly you cannot calculate the precise value of something if it is being distorted or if it is being owned. Clearly market competition is better at this. The second extension we have explains why you just don't get access to IMF loans or foreign direct investment. And I would just tell you to weigh this specific extension above everything else in the debate for 2 reasons. First, because this one has the widest impact. It affects everyone in the economy, the others are specific. The second reason, which I guess interacts with this one, is it is the least speculative. You do not get these loans because this liberalization was a condition of those loans. Had this pressure not been applied, those loans wouldn't have been offered in the first place. Which means, no, I'll take you later, that any of the material, I guess, that comes closest to this impact, the very speculative material about civil wars, which are complex, multifactorial, involve lots of different actors, this is a much simpler claim. You ought weigh it over everything else in the debate, because it's just more certain. What are the 2 responses we get? The first is to say, well, these loans were coercive, so they're intrinsically bad. The global economy is coercive. Some institutions have more power than others. It's admitted by opening that maybe there would have been other kinds of liberalization to do things like get access to trade. So it's unclear why this specific form of liberalisation is worse, but also the government's power over the market is coercive, the government's subsidisation of some industries over others is coercive. Super unclear why this specific form of coercion is magically worse for some reason. Like, again, also I will explain why you're likely to get other forms of coercion in my direct responses to closing government. The second response that they have is that there is an incentive to keep these countries afloat regardless, so you still provide those loans. But you do, maybe you still have the incentive, but you do not believe that these countries will use those loans effectively, because when you provide those loans, you think they're going to use them to do shitty subsidies that you don't believe are good for their economy. So you never offer those loans in the first place, because you just be throwing money into a void. You do not believe these countries will use these effectively regardless, so you just don't offer them in the first place. That response fails. On to CG. First, before I give individual responses to their arguments, I'll just do some net weighing, because I think they are extraordinarily uncomparative. Because we explain why we get better outcomes for the economy as a whole. If you do not get access to these loans, you do not get the critical development you need. And we explain, and as a result, if your economy tanks, predatory actors, as Lachie points out in POI, will just buy up all these assets in the first place when they tank, right? They'll just buy up your manufacturing assets as well when your economy crashes. They'll buy up other aspects of your economy, right? Like in the same way, like people bought up all the housing when the GFC happens, they will buy up your assets in your economy as well. And Brendan tries to get this out of the debate by saying, well, in that case, it's just symmetric. But it's not for two reasons. First, because this is far more universal. This is predatory aspects in every aspect of your economy. But second, because this is actively probably more coercive. Like on our side, like the market is liberalizing, but you still have some agency over whether you are someone who wants to sell your farm. On their side, you are destitute, you have faced horrific economic conditions, you're in the most possible coercive situation. Clearly this is much worse by the very metric they use to try and beat us. The second claim, though, I would just note again, is that if there is such immense pressure for one multinational corporation to buy up all of the farmland like they gesture to, wouldn't they just do the Banana Republic? And that's also worse in that case, because instead of having it done in a formalized contract where you engage some concessions like we talk about, instead they just violently overthrow your government and there is nothing formal about it. That's clearly far worse. Responding specifically to their material though, I just think very little of it stands. For example, the material on neocolonialism just ignores the fact that I think it's deeply unclear why it will specifically manifest in one company buying up all of the land in a way that is specifically neocolonial. Deeply unclear to me why farmers have such a huge incentive to sell, especially when I think it's I just don't think this is particularly true, and I think they don't ever explain why this is the specific tipping point for a civil war. The material on being vulnerable to shocks ignores the fact that first, domestic instability is far more likely, and second, that you're probably most vulnerable to price shocks when your economy is unstable and when you lack development, things that we get over through our extension explain why you get access to loans. The final thing that they explain is that this cuts out smaller farmers. We would just explain that these farmers probably get investment from more foreign investment because they believe that these farmers might, if these farmers have the capacity to compete. And if they can't, that's okay, because the development that is injected through things like those loans lets those farmers transition to better, more competitive industries. I'll take a point from opening.
If the IMF refused to give you money on the basis that you have illiberal agricultural industry, isn't that pressure, which is the thing we oppose?
Yes, but it's also pressure when the government puts coercive economic subsidies to overlay some parts of the economy over others. It is also pressure when the IMF puts pressure on other industries, which you yourselves acknowledge you would liberalize in other contexts. You're like, oh, we will do other kinds of liberalization to unlock some kinds of benefits. So it's so unclear why you protest specifically with the agricultural policy. You don't have a consistent principle, so you clearly don't believe in it at all. Next, on opening government, I think we clearly just co-opt all of their benefits when we just explain the free market is a good and effective thing. Because all of their economic harms, when they concede that liberalization doesn't happen to the full extent that they claim, because the IMF they don't unlock the best parts of IMF loans, but they still faff around vaguely with the idea that they might liberalize in other ways. So they can't unlock the principle that they try to claim, which I don't know if they run, even if they manage to run this principle, they clearly don't believe in it enough to actually vouch for it all the way. They clearly don't believe in it enough to claim autonomy of these nations. But I would note here that they're still vulnerable to the predatory behavior of large corporations, because when you tank your economy because you don't accept the investment, then predatory corporations just buy up everything anyway, so you still face coercive pressure. It's just worse because now your people are far worse economically than they were in the counterfactual. We co-opt all their benefits, but we explain that the free market is good. And even their social and political harms, we co-opt as well, because surely the kind of political instability that they talk about and the predatory cartels are capable of being most predatory when you're facing and you don't have access to these loans and you don't get the economic development. Finally, on OO, I would note here that Ziggy's case is contingent on one central mechanism, which is essentially just that when you do this, you get access to global markets. But in this case, it is ambiguous. In some of the context Ziggy talks about, it's very clear that it isn't, but it is ambiguous by the end of opening half to what extent you had access to global markets already. It is unclear how much, neither side is able to prove precisely, and I think it is it's most likely because in some contexts it is state-owned, in other contexts perhaps it is things like subsidies. It is unclear that you had access to markets already. We sidestep this because we just explain why you're able to get access to other kinds of development that are just far more important. And we explain why, independently of selling to global markets, the market is better at determining this. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks for a great debate. The way this oral adjudication will work is I'll give you 2 pieces of general feedback. I'll explain the call and I'll go through the debate chronologically, explaining the call as we go. In terms of general feedback, number 1, we're dealing with a regret debate, which means that we're talking about stuff that has happened in the past, which means that any examples or case studies that you can bring up in your speech are going to be more persuasive than they might be in a regular old opposes or supports motion. However, I thought at times there was a dearth of the examples in this debate, and that was a way that teams could have brought up the level of analysis they were given. Secondly, I think in debates like this, where fundamental parts of the debate, in terms of what is a allowable argument, get contested, we need to have more even-if analysis. So there's obviously a very big clash, particularly on the, long diagonal, over what it means to put pressure on a country to liberalize their agricultural economy. I think teams, when this is brought up early on in the debate and later throughout the debate, could do more work to give. Even if this version of the debate is true, we still win for these reasons, or even if that version of the debate is true, we still win for these reasons, style of analysis. So that's my general feedback for this round. Otherwise, I thought it was really high quality for a very technical and potentially tricky debate. I was actually very happy to watch this debate and found it quite enjoyable. Here is how we saw the debate. First goes to closing government, second to opening government, third to closing opposition, and the fourth to opening opposition. So let me explain the debate chronologically, and hopefully this will make sense as we go through. I will say that many of these splits were quite close, and that should hopefully come out through my analysis. So we'll start with OG. OG gives us some clear setup, although elements of it do get contested, and we'll talk about that later in the OA. They say subsidies would be in place in their world and outline some plausible benefits like more competitive exports, the ability to compete with the European Union and subsidized markets. They give me an explanation of how maybe other options for these countries would require more investment, like factories. I thought that was relatively assertive in the debate. There was an argument about fuel subsidies, which I think was contested by opening opposition in terms of whether it was an allowable argument in the round. And lastly, there was an argument about food security, which I thought was easy to understand, but needed a little bit more impacting, and I really think was an important argument in this debate. Side opening opposition then, let's bring them in, runs an argument primarily around access to Western markets. They say this trade liberalization prevented dumping and had a number of different impacts. For example, individual farmers would be able to get more money because the unit price of each good would be higher, which they could then reinvest, which would lead to development of the country, for example. Let's explain this split. I think the reason why opening government takes over opening opposition are threefold. I think firstly, opening opposition's case has a load-bearing premise, which is that a lot of these countries have a very strong incentive to engage in dumping, and that these types of trade liberalization prevented this. I think the first part of this, which is that countries have a strong incentive to engage in dumping, was, I think, very unclear and needed a lot more explanation. If it was in the speech, it wasn't delivered very clearly, and I think it needed to be explained, I think, in a lot more detail. Otherwise, I just did not understand why dumping would happen at the scale that side opening opposition said it would. I think that was load-bearing for a lot of the impacts of that case. Secondly, given I thought many of the splits in this debate were close to this matters, opening opposition unfortunately doesn't take a POI in their second speech. It is not in the room for the government member speech, unfortunately, so it's unable to offer a POI, although I guess that doesn't interact necessarily with opening government. And then lastly, on the argument about access to Western markets, I think there is a plausible response that comes out from side opening government, which says, well, in our world, we're still engaging with the World Trade Organization or in agriculture, so you get access to all these other markets, and maybe that's good enough. I think obviously it doesn't respond in whole to what side opening opposition is saying, but I think it reduces the impact somewhat. That's not to say that opening opposition was a bad set of speeches. I found them very engaging. I found the examples given, particularly at the deputy speech, to be quite good and quite strong. I think it's just unfortunate how this debate went for this case, unfortunately. Let's now bring in side closing government. Side closing government gives me a few things in extension. They firstly say, well, we're talking about often recently decolonized countries, so there'll be a lot of, one, backlash if you agree what Western countries want, and secondly, maybe principally it's not something we want, so there's a neo-colonial imposition on these countries. There's also an extension about being vulnerable to price shocks, which I thought was stepped through quite well, and an explanation about how even if international conglomerates set up, they would do so in a way which takes money out of the economy. Now, on these first couple of extensions about recently decolonized countries, I do have a question about how many countries we're talking about. What are some examples? I think I broadly believe the mechanization. I'm not sure how broad a set of countries this is, I guess, applying to in this debate. Let's now, I guess, position this extension with the other teams in the debate. Positioning against opening opposition, the rationale is I think, fairly similar to the rationale of OO versus OG. I will also note that the explanation of price shocks from side closing government interacts very nicely with the OO case, because it explains how potentially access to a broader set of markets and Western markets could be a negative insofar as it means that now your economy is a lot more susceptible to things like food price shocks caused by a war, for example. Comparing to side opening government, this was a very close split, and the way we did it was just a comparison of impacts. Side opening government says, well, subsidies would still be in place, and they give benefits like competitive exports, ability to compete with the European Union. Side closing government gives me arguments about, well, the economy becomes more vulnerable to price shocks. I think the impacting of this argument in particular was a lot more impactful for me as an adjudicator, and I think for the ordinary intelligent voter, than any of the argumentation that we get around, for example, the ability to export a bit more, for the reason that I can visualize very clearly, well, you're going to be turning to, countries which are going to be trapping you in debt, or you're not getting any revenue at all from your exports because the price shock occurs, or your economy completely crumbles because you've built up this massive sector and then it crumbles overnight due to the price shock, seem very impactful and very important. And on a weight comparison of impacts, I think this argument is enough to get up over side opening government. But I think it's very close, and I think opening government was very close in getting up over these arguments if they were able to impact their arguments more, deepen those impacts, and weigh them up against what they think other teams are likely to give later on. Let's now bring up side closing opposition. This was the hardest team to place in this debate. For a lot of the debate, I had closing opposition as winning this round, but that as the debate progressed, I do unfortunately think they do fall a little bit short. So what do we get from side CO in extension? I think we get a few things. Firstly, we get an explanation about how state-run agriculture is bad. This is, I guess, foreshadowed in the point of introduction and mechanized quite well. We're explaining how setting prices and subsidies requires heaps of detailed data on efficiency, which countries like this might not have, that people are preferentially wanting to enrich themselves and their friends. There's a chance you just mess up. This causes distortions, you produce too much of the wrong food, you don't get any money. That's later impacted at width as well. Second extension is around the fiscal cliff. So we're told that if an industry cannot sustain agriculture without subsidies, then perhaps we shouldn't be propping up those industries artificially. And finally, we're given an argument about loans. And when loans are taken, and IMF loans or negotiation with the World Trade Organization might take place in a scenario where your economy is in a lot of strife, schools aren't being opened, roads aren't being built, and perhaps a really big impact would be we just want to take the loan. Yes, maybe we have to liberalize our agricultural sector. Maybe there's some harms of that, but this is just so much more important. I'll deal in a vacuum with this last argument in the debate, because I think it was very interesting and ended up being a bit of a head scratcher as an adjudicator. That is because it's repeatedly pointed out in points of information, primarily from, I think, opening government, that, and I guess in the way this debate is set up, that this is a world in which loans would still be offered to these countries, but there just wouldn't be any pressure when these loans are, I guess, offered to countries to liberalize your agricultural sector when that happens. Now, I think potentially there are some ways side closing opposition could get around this. They could say, well, perhaps the loans would be smaller. Maybe this is a tipping point where some countries don't take loans. But this isn't the way I understand this debate. How side closing opposition gets over this argument is rather an attempt to say, well, no, within the debate functions as you don't get these loans, and that's part of regretting the pressure. Whereas I think it is well established from side government, side opening government in particular, that's not the way this debate takes place. And therefore I wasn't willing to credit the argument about loans to the greatest extent in this debate. And that is, I think, unfortunate, because I think it was a very, very potentially strong argument from side closing opposition. So now let's compare the other teams more directly. So with, in regards to side opening government, I do think we get, number one, some very good implicit response to side CO from opening government. So for example, all of the argumentation we hear about like a fiscal cliff, for example, I think is implicitly responded to by the opening government argument, which is that often these countries are forced to engage in subsidies because they're competing with other subsidized economies like the European Union. So I thought that, I think, gets over all of that fiscal cliff analysis that we get from side closing opposition. And then it is again left as a, I guess, comparison of impacts. Do I believe more that, well, state-run agriculture is really bad, people are going to be preferentially enriching themselves? I do think, of course, there is, you know, or are people going to be preferentially enriching themselves? How bad is that? And then I've just closed my notes, but the OA is not over. Are they going to be preferentially enriching themselves, or do we care more about, you know, the impact of subsidies, the impact of being able to like keep a market afloat, give people jobs, and so on and so forth? I do think that while I think this is a very well mechanized argument about separating agriculture being bad, about like, you know, well, maybe you don't have the right data, you're going to preferentially enrich yourself. I just was really unsure about like, okay, what is the level of distortion that takes place? Like it suggested, well, like you're producing too much of the wrong food, you're not getting enough money, like you're being really inefficient. How big is that is unclear to me as an adjudicator. Whereas arguments around like, well, you know, you don't have the ability to like prop up like farmers and food security gets threatened is very clear and very concrete. For that reason, I'm willing to position side opening government over what we get from CO. And then lastly, compared to side closing government, I think there is decent direct response to closing government that comes out, to closing opposition that comes out from CO. Like for example, I think a lot of the argumentation around, I think, side closing opposition's best argument around state-run agriculture is not defeated entirely, but like mitigated to a sufficient extent that I weigh up the entirety of the CG case over the CO case. Like for example, we're told, like, you know, if a lot of your employment is coming from agriculture, it seems like a lot of these people would have a lot of influence over the government, would be able to have input, or potentially we're not talking about countries that have like no access to the internet, no ability to tweak things, or maybe they're going to be smart people that live here and understand how to tweak the dials. I think some of these claims are somewhat simple. I don't think they completely defeat the argument. I think they mitigate it sufficiently that I'm willing to position side closing government over side closing law. Again, I think some of these, I think, splits were fairly close in the debate, but that's how we saw it. And you are welcome to come and get asked